Welcome to the War Academy channel. In mid-1944, the successful campaigns of the German army were far away, and the military operations they had to face were very different. Although during the first phase of the conflict, the Wehrmacht stood out for its capacity for the offensive, and for its frenetic victories, during the last years it would do so for its stubborn defense, in the face of a critical situation and total collapse. Although a few days ago, we saw how the Soviets prepared to launch their offensives during the summer of 1944, today we will analyze what measures the Germans adopted to defend themselves against them. If we see the European map of the middle of the year 44, we appreciate how the territory occupied by Germany was still quite large. With the expectations of repelling the Allied invasion of France, and the calculations that were being made about the Red Army, which led them to think that it was exhausted, and that it would not be capable of launching major offensives, many German leaders dreamed of the possibility of resisting indefinitely. Even with these erroneous forecasts that they had about the military capacity of their enemies, they had to face the reality in which their army found itself, this being even worse. According to different sources, the number of troops that the Germans had to defend the Eastern Front in mid-1944 was approximately 1.5 million soldiers. This figure, although it may seem high, was nothing compared to what his enemy had. Still, many of these fighters were far from the professional, well-trained military men of 1940 or 1941, many of them simple conscripts with little training or experience. David Glantz's ratio of German and Soviet forces is as follows. For every German soldier on the Eastern Front, there were 3.7 Soviet soldiers. For every German panzer, the Soviets had 8.2 main battle tanks, and for every German artillery piece, there were more than 13 in the Red Army. Based on this weakness, and given the critical lack of soldiers, the German High Command had to establish a new defensive strategy, based on the so-called fortress cities and the creation of smaller armored units, which would go from one breakpoint to another to try to plug the gaps. Although the establishment of these fortress cities, in which German units were forced to resist to the last man, has been widely criticized, the truth is that the real meaning they had has never been fully explained. With a front line of more than 2,000 kilometers, the defensive section that each infantry division had assigned was 32 kilometers. This makes us that more than 60 German divisions had to be used in this task, which did not offer any guarantee. And it is that, having to stretch the defensive line so much, it was practically impossible to be able to establish second and third lines in the rear, thus giving depth to the defense. This aspect is very important, because during the development of the conflict, it was shown that the most effective defenses were those that were raised in depth with several lines, instead of a single rigid line. However, due to the lack of soldiers, only weak second lines could be established, very close to the main one. As if that were not enough, these divisions could not effectively cover these 32 kilometers of line either, and many sections had to be left without any type of garrison. The only thing they could do was establish patrols that moved from one point to another, and watched over these gaps that had to be left in the absence of troops. This situation did nothing but increase Soviet infiltration of the German rear guard, which took advantage of these gaps to slip in during the night. These actions served to reinforce the partisans, or to directly create new nuclei of fighters in the German rear, which further weakened the main front line. As axes of union between division and division, or directly in between, a series of fortress cities were established, in which the concentration of German units was somewhat higher. At these points it was expected that the German army would statically entrench itself and resist as long as possible. This strategy pursued that the Soviets had to besiege all these points, using a large number of troops to do so. This was intended to slow down the Soviet spearheads and end up stuck in these cities. While this was happening, the panzer units and reserve would have time to reach these points, and would help the besieged troops. While this strategy might make sense on paper, and based on Germany's small number of troops, it might be their best option as a last hope, once the Soviets attacked, Nothing went according to plan. Basically, the Soviets simply surrounded these fortified points, after which they continued to advance deep into the German rear. With the entire front line broken, and faced with the risk of being surrounded hundreds of kilometers away from the new German positions, the vast majority of units fell back as best they could. They saw it useless to resist in a position without any strategic value, in which they would have to succumb slowly after heavy daily Soviet bombardments. With regard to the armored units, which had to rush to these breakout points, it must be said that they were totally outmatched by the overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, and could do little to stop the advance of the enemy vanguard. In addition, many of these panzer units remained fixed in their positions, waiting for offensives that turned out to be a mere decoy, so that they did not go to the main focus. As if that were not enough, the Soviet Air Force was in charge of strongly crushing these units, while they moved from their starting positions to the combat zone. This meant that the German armored units reached the breakpoints completely depleted. During the year of 1945, in the defense of the Vistula, many of these panzer divisions were located very close to the front, precisely to shorten the arrival times and the exposure to air attacks during the journeys. This measure went very wrong again, because they were in direct range of the Soviet artillery, and were partly annihilated by it already on the first day of the attack. This way of proceeding has been criticized by many authors and fans on the subject, who instead have opted for the possibility of having carried out flexible defenses. These basically consist of progressively withdrawing units to later launch strong counterattacks at previously fixed favorable points. This is a good measure when we are talking about front lines with a few kilometers or tens, and as long as there is a large number of armored and mechanized units capable of carrying out these powerful counterattacks. However, this time the front breaks were hundreds of kilometers long, and the ability to withdraw this high number of units, as well as to directly abandon entire countries, was very limited. In any case, and even having managed to adequately withdraw its units, the German Summer Army of 1944 did not have the capacity to launch strong counterattacks with the aim of advancing hundreds of kilometers, so the abandoned territory would have been destroyed. Ended up losing just the same. In summary, all these points lead us to the conclusion that the difference between the two sides was so great by the date in mid-1944 that any option to adopt was equally bad, and had strong negative points. To this precarious situation, we have to add the definitive opening of the Western Front on the Normandy coast, which diverted a large number of units, and the definitive disintegration of the alliances that Germany continued to maintain with countries such as Finland, Romania or Bulgaria. So, based on this, do you consider that the defensive measures adopted by the Germans on the Eastern Front in this last year were correct? Do you think another strategy would have offered better results? If you want to expand this information, I'll leave you in the description the programs that we have made on this matter, these being the last direct with Carlos Caballero Jurado, or the video on the Soviet planning of Bagration. The books that have helped us prepare this program have been Clash of the Titans by David Glantz, Operation Bagration by Antonio Mundes and Siege, which I also leave below. That's all. Subscribe and support this channel if you like this program, and see you in the next one. See you soon.